the vast majority of farmers in the area I am in literally are planting for failure. And so what that means is with the government programs, the farmers are paid disaster if they have crop failure through government programs, and they're paid per row foot. So you have guys planting something like cotton every row in an environment that's sometimes very desert. We can go through periods of drought, and they're literally planting and growing for failure because that's what's going to pay the bills. When commodity prices are down like this, they'll make more money from a failed crop than they will a successful crop.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm always trying to bring you the brightest minds and those that can bend around a corner to see trends into the future. And today, One Horse Farmer joins me. We've had a couple conversations before. We met in person as well. So I wanted to invite him on the show because the last conversation we had, just talking about life and like, how's your farm doing? How's my farm doing? Because he is a real traditional farmer himself, got cattle, everything. And we could talk about that. That comes into the food production, because if we're looking for solutions, we want to look for really people who are in farm operations that are producing the food, that have a philosophy of being in tune with the land and understand homesteading and maybe prices for build outs. Because we're operating in a world where zeros and ones matter, not in a digital sense, but bottom line, those pennies, those dollars, they count. So to hear it from somebody who is really in the more profitability side of it on what I would consider a business end of farming. That's why I wanted to bring him on, because there's a lot of things going on with food production and these rivers from the sky that we're seeing, and a lot of variance in ashfall at 60 north and above because volcanic eruptions in Russia. And there's everywhere you look, you see crop declines. So what does it mean to somebody who's actually on the ground in a viable place, Texas? There's different variants of zones there for wetter, drier, but what does it portend for the future? Because, somebody who's actually in the fields, out putting the feet in the dirt, hands in the dirt, can tell you if there's changes going on. Because I'll say one last thing. We usually can grow basil. It's like a weed for us here in East Tennessee. So easy to grow. This year, we couldn't grow it at all. We got these spindly, like not even a foot tall plants. And it just baffles me because before we'd have to trim them back all the time. They'd actually come over the sidewalk. You couldn't really walk there. You'd always be trimming them off. But this year, something's very different. Something's happened where, just example, that's one species not growing so well. Our plums didn't do too well either. Really cold in the beginning, and all the smallest of fruit, after they formed, they all got frozen through and fell off. We lost thousands and thousands and thousands of plums this year. So for us, it's hit or miss. And One Horse Farmer, I appreciate you joining me. Thanks. And floor's yours.
Yeah, Dave, thanks for having me. Super cool getting to chat with you, hear what you're doing on your farm, talk about a little bit of what I'm doing in food production and homesteading and things of that nature. And it's funny that you bring up your on the ground situation on your farm with, I don't know what you want to call it, not necessarily crop failure, but just overall maybe crop difficulties this year. I've seen that on the homestead, and it's been kind of weird. A lot of stuff that traditionally has grown prolifically for me in this part of Texas was surprisingly a struggle. Can't really put my finger on it. This year, as far as overall, I don't know, climate, rainfall, it was a much cooler summer than normal, much wetter early summer. And you would think it would have been the perfect situation to have abundance. And like I said, a lot of my go-to crops were less than good. So it's been an interesting year.
The obvious question, are you on shrooms? Illuminated shrooms, combining 6 powerful mycelium in a Fulvic mineral delivery system, selected for their synergistic, restorative, and protective actions. Potent organic extracts of cordyceps for stamina, lion mane for cognition, reishi for longevity, chaga for detoxification, agaricus for resistance, nutrient-rich turkey tail, a new standard and excellent illuminated shrooms from Alfa Vedic. And please remember, ladies and gentlemen, every purchase you make helps keep this podcast on air, bringing information just like this, because we're at this critical juncture right now in our civilization, our society. We need to share information more than ever. We need more solutions than ever. And sponsors like Alfa Vedic keeping us on air just like this. Your support to them helps support us, because we need to go through this together. And the more discussion and the more solutions, the easier it's going to be. So please remember that link's in the description box below. And are you shrooming? Yeah, I would say I would follow up. I was just did an interview yesterday with Danny King from Deep South Homestead. He's down in Mississippi. And he was saying the same thing, like one of the easiest crops they grow down there called butter beans. He was unable to get them to grow. They had to replant 3 times to get just some moderate production. So it doesn't really matter where we're seeing across the U.S. I'm in Tennessee, you're in Texas, he's in Mississippi. 3 reports of the exact same thing happening with different crops. So any idea, is you think it's UV radiation coming in at a higher level? Or, something is affecting crop yields globally. The rice is happening, across Asia, they're getting all these floods, and there's a lot of things denting into production on regular staple grain crops. Any idea of what you think the trigger is for all this?
Someone on the ground, one of the things with farming, food production, homesteading, one of the biggest tools in your toolkit is observation. Observing is a skill set that you have to develop over time. And observing is not just seeing. Observing is seeing and knowing what you're seeing, and then storing that information for future use, right? So pretty much anything I could say would be anecdotal. Again, much cooler summer this year. You just would have thought a lot of things really would have taken off. It was almost if some of the go-to crops were stunted to a certain extent. They weren't quite as healthy as normal. I have no idea what to chalk it up to. But again, you're on the ground, you're seeing it, just kind of keeping an eye, building a mental toolbox, and trying to come to some conclusion as time goes along. You're just kind of at the mercy of climate. You're at the mercy of nature. And that's one of the big deals with farming, whether you're small scale like me or you're larger scale. There's only so many things that you can control, and you better try to control what you can control absolutely as much as you can, because of all the factors that are out of our control. There's just nothing we can do, and we have to adapt, and we have to find solutions to problems. So for me, going into the fall, as summer's winding down, I'm looking at the spring and the summer crops and saying, what are some solutions to some problems? So you kind of go back to your mental notebook, or some people have a physical notebook or spreadsheet, and you look at your process, right? Your soil preparation, your soil amendments, your fertilization, your insect control. Just go down the list, and am I following this repeatable process? Am I a part of the problem here that I've seen? You try to go through and check those off and say, no, that process, I've used it repeatedly, it's been sound, that's not the problem. So that's kind of where I'm now, is just troubleshooting. Someone like you've got a real good ear to the ground on the climate situation. And so people like me, we listen to guys like you to try to get what the vibe is really going on.
You pointed out something super important. Just knowing that you need to notice. A lot of people never would even consider that. They just kind of go through, plants are here, plants are there. You go to the summer farmers market, stuff's available. They're just used to seeing available produce to buy. But have they taken note of, why is there very little strawberry this year? Why is there no XYZ? Those watermelon look really small this year. Why aren't any of the yellow watermelon available this year? They're not noticing on the small stuff. They're just looking plainly out there and say, well, there's still food available. I see farmers market was full. Every table had stuff for sale. Vegetables, fruits, flowers. But have they been exploring it and taking notes of the changes of what's available or not available? So even that tiny bit of knowledge right there to notice and observe and take notes on it. I'm sure you would see a trend if you had, because you talk about spreadsheets. Nobody's a fan of spreadsheets really, unless you need it to measure. Because when I was younger,
Yeah.
somebody said you can't adjust on something you can't measure. So if you're not measuring, then you can never adjust because you're just kind of in the ether moving through it with no metric on, which way to go. Because I saw an article today, and if I might read this one, somebody sent it to me earlier today. It comes from AgWeb. Sticker shock: farmers' frustration over high fertilizer prices. Commodity prices will soar into fall. I watched the video and it was kind of scary because they said it was something like 80% of all the crops right now are at a loss on a per ton basis for the farmers.
So, one of the things that kind of the general public doesn't understand about agriculture in general is, you have big agriculture. I call them commodity farmers. I have a buddy that lives locally that he's a commodity farmer, right? So he's farming in a style that is commercial, huge machines. I mean, we're talking tractors that are $400,000, combines that are close to 1 million, cotton strippers that are close to $1 million. He's farming several thousand acres. The amount of debt he takes out every year to accomplish what his goals are is unbelievable. Then you have someone like me who's in the regenerative space, small scale homesteads size, completely different methodology, completely different processes of growing food. And in a lot of ways, they are on the opposite ends of the spectrum. We see a big push in the recent last decade of the regenerative farming with nature, not against it, things of that nature. It's been kind of at the forefront a lot in conversations through social media and podcasts and things of that nature. And so, yeah, guys in the commodity space, they're really, really struggling. If it wasn't for essentially government bailouts, they would be in really tough situation. And so, yeah, we're kind of at a turning point. What's crazy about commodities right now is you have some commodities that are just super high. Then you have other commodities like wheat. I believe I saw the other day corn was at record lows. And so these guys are planting these crops and the prices just aren't there. And so, yeah, the American farmer, whether big or small, is definitely in trouble. But the commodity big ag guys that are dependent on this massive machine of huge machines, fertilizers coming from oftentimes 1,000 miles away, the chemical based fertilizers, the chemical based herbicides. It's just, in a lot of ways, it's an unsustainable pathway of agriculture, in my opinion.
So as you were talking, I pulled up the chart here, and I made a mistake. It was for the average cost to grow an acre of said target species. So this is from the National Corn Growers Association. Now, this is a per acre net profit. Since you mentioned corn, they're at a negative $180 per acre for production, meaning that every acre they produce and grow, they lose $180. That's okay if you got 1 acre, but these generally they're running on 5,000 acres, right? 10,000 acres on some of these larger 100,000 acres even too.
The thing is the small commodity commercial big ag farmer, kind of like my buddy, it's just him by himself. He hires some seasonal help. Those guys are going to the wayside. They're being priced out. And so what you have are these massive, large farming operations that, just like you said, 20,000 to 100,000 acres of production. It's really something to behold when you start getting into farms that size.
Yeah, I knew somebody who was in that game for land purchases and acquisitions. They would buy out the smaller farmers. Somebody had like 500 acres, that's a small one.
Yeah.
They would normally tear down the farmhouse because it would set off their GPS because they'd have to go around it. So they would just prefer to tear down the old farmhouse so they wouldn't have to do any turns on their machinery in the fields, right? So you got to think about it. They're at that level where they're going to waste a $250,000 farmhouse, tear it to the ground, fill it in with soil, so then they can just run a straight line with their GPS versus having to go around that, the old driveway, the old barn that was out. They just strip it all down to just bare earth and roll through and then replant on top of that.
Well, and that's calling in big time farming practices. That's a whole rabbit hole in and of itself. When you're talking about agriculture, when you're talking about farming, it spans such a huge swath of sizes. And I got into regenerative farming practices from the standpoint of, my dad was a commodity farmer growing up. He did very well for himself, farming cotton, farming wheat. And as I got into high school, he ended up selling out. And a lot of the guys around the community were like, what are you doing? You're the most successful farmer in the area. And he just saw the writing on the wall that things were changing and he was going to get out, while his equipment was worth the most. And he walked away. And so now we're stuck in this rat race of, my buddy who's the commodity farmer. We're talking all the time. He's just like, I don't know how much longer I can do this. Equipment, just everything we've talked about is just piling on him. So, much of our conventional food in this country, in terms of your wheat, your corn, your soybeans, they're coming from these commercial grows, and there's some problems. So we need to find some solutions.
I got a couple more numbers since you mentioned cotton right there. This year's production per acre net profit loss will be $384 per acre loss net on cotton. 120 on beans, down 120 negative, $106 negative on wheat. And then it looks like sorghum, at least from the drawing, $185. But they do mainly sorghum down where you are in Texas and Oklahoma there, that panhandle thing. That's a kind of a specialty crop. They only grow in one or two parts of America here. But you see all those. What did I just notice for anybody who was paying attention? Corn negative 180, beans on negative 120, wheat 100 negative, 106 negative, cotton 384 negative, sorghum 185 negative. Do you see the picture here that we're running into? The fertilizer cost and the cost of running for agriculture is below break even substantially. If it was $5, okay, $10, I get it, because there was a plus $9 for wheat back 5 years ago. It was $9 plus for, and beans was $76 on the positive side 5 years ago. But how can anybody continue when almost every major crop is at a negative running loss on a per acre basis here? What about the crop insurance? That costs money too, because to insure my house, it keeps going up 5% per year, sometimes 10% per year, every single year. Like, how long is it before they can't insure their machinery? They can't and get the crop insurance itself because it's so expensive. And then what happens if one day they decide to pull the plug on subsidies for farmers? That movie King Corn, I don't know if anybody's ever seen that. Absolutely must watch. It shows the amount of subsidies for corn farmers that are out there. And if they were unable to get any types of subsidies that run through from our government, you're not going to have food on the table. So it brings me into that whole discussion of, okay, we see the economy shifting right now. We're moving into cryptocurrencies and sort of stable coin and CBDC issuance across the planet. They want to tokenize everything. But if there is a major breakdown, I'm just saying then my whole first thing and foremost is, where's the financing for these farmers going to come from? Because without farm finance, we don't have any food. And it gets us in this, spinning loop here of how can they keep producing at such losses across all these major grain crops here and cotton too?
And I think we've got to find answers to that. This isn't to fade like commercial farmers. There's a lot of good guys that are big ag farmers, just like my friend, and we go back and forth on my style of farming that's using natural things that, I don't use herbicides. I don't use pesticides. I don't use GMO seeds. I'm getting into seed saving, just a whole number of things. It's just totally opposite of what he's doing. But he tells me, the area that I am is not a conducive place to be growing high quality produce. It's primarily cotton, dry, and it's all dry land, meaning they don't have irrigation. And he's told me straight up that the vast majority of farmers in the area I am in literally are planting for failure. And so what that means is with the government programs, and I'm no expert in this side of the commercial farming, but as I understand it from him, the farmers are paid disaster if they have crop failure through government programs, and they're paid per row foot. So you have guys planting something like cotton every row in an environment that's sometimes very desert. We can go through periods of drought, and they're literally planting and growing for failure because that's what's going to pay the bills. When commodity prices are down like this, they'll make more money from a failed crop than they will a successful crop. And it's just a broken machine through and through. Anytime when we reward ourselves for failure instead of success, how is that sustainable?
Well, it's simply not. I mean, it has been to this point, and everything works until it doesn't. See, that's
Yeah.
the kind of wall we're coming up against, where it's all worked until this point, until it doesn't. And you look at the reason that Trump's trying to get all these stablecoin issuances out there, because it'll spur that demand for U.S. treasuries by all these companies and governments wanting U.S. stablecoins, but they'll have to have the treasuries to back it up as a one-to-one to issue the stablecoin that can be used anywhere in the world. They want to try to give a taxi driver or Uber driver in Brazil the option to get paid in USD stablecoins compared to taking native real. Just gravitation towards stability. Everybody's going to want to get the USDC or USDT stablecoin as payment in their local economies as a hedge against their inflation. So it's just going to drive demand again and again and again, because our system worked until it didn't, and they had to find a solution for it. And that is and was the solution. So phosphate fertilizer prices soar to record highs. And then also DAP is, let me see here. Yeah, NOLA DAP is also at all-time record high. So when you're looking at two major crop inputs, I mean, the system works until it doesn't. Are we ready for the average individual to turn their backyard into a farm like we did during World War II in the Victory Garden phase of America?
I don't think so. Now, there is a large movement that's happened, over the last 10 years of people securing their food supply more and more. But the reality, at least for Americans, or just call, people that live a first world lifestyle, we're so disconnected from the process of food in general that we don't even know what seasons things grow. Right. So I'm kind of a big fan of eating seasonally, eating produce or whatever within the season that it thrives and it grows throughout kind of a yearly cycle of growing. You're going to have different crops throughout the entire year that are prolific at different times, and you don't try to grow this in the summer that grows in the winter and vice versa. And so, your diet becomes really diverse, and you're eating a lot of good things. But yeah, to your point, I think there was a lot of people that kind of dipped their toe into some food production during the whole COVID event. I think a lot of people saw how difficult it was. I promise you, there was a lot of abandoned backyard gardens right now, grow beds in the backyard full of Bermuda grass, and because we value convenience, we don't value security. I kind of think that's where we're at. But yeah, at some point, the pendulum's going to have to swing towards local communities taking care of themselves in terms of food production.
See, our atmosphere has some tremendous disruption to it. So it doesn't matter if it's Southern Hemisphere, Northern Hemisphere, we are getting all of these incredibly unusual events coming out. So if it's difficult at best when things are kind of benign and it's easy for food production, then what happens when we come into the extremes? Like, how do we even start to protect against that? Greenhouses, but who can afford a greenhouse?
Yeah, so you're kind of getting into, what I was talking about earlier, a little bit of like control. It's one of the aspects of food production that's a big deal. In my environment, naturally, we can go, there's some summers that we're over 105 for 4 or 5 straight weeks. We have some winters that we're in negative temperatures. we'll have 70, 80 mile an hour straight line winds. You just name it. It's not a great place to grow market quality produce. You have to develop processes to defeat these things. And so tunnels are a great way to do that. But like you said, they're not cheap. If you go and buy a full greenhouse kit, you're talking thousands of dollars. I developed my own style of tunnels that are robust, and they perform, they hold up to the winds. So yeah, just solutions to problems. But to your point of the changes that seem to be going on, we just have to find answers. And for someone that's on the ground growing it, you're trying to do that in real time. A storm comes out of nowhere in the middle of the night, you're rushing out there trying to put netting over the top of produce to prevent hail from beating it up or whatever it may be. But at some point you have to step back and really take in the overall situation, and are my solutions good enough? And just going back to the drawing board and trying to find more.
So your tunnels then, because just in a general sense, somebody would say 6 millimeter poly. Okay, well that can get ripped and torn pretty easy.
Yes, sir.
High winds and hail events and blowing debris. So what are you using? And you said it's pretty robust. So you're talking about Texas.
So I'm using just pretty much what would be considered kind of your commercial quality poly tunnels. It's using the 6 mil greenhouse plastic. You can see all of ways to build tunnels online. I'm just using bending my own hoops, making my own metal hoop. And wind does take a toll. But for me, everything I have to do and my whole entire system is all about one man, right? So everything I do has to be built around one person being the machine. And so I've built my tunnels in a way that are repeatable for me with the least amount of effort, the least amount of input cost. And so, just like this spring, the current tunnels I have right now, a couple of years old, you're wanting to try to get at least 5 years out of the plastic. We had crazy 80 mile an hour straight line winds that came through and blew for several hours. And just so happened to catch them broadside. And once you start getting a tear or anything in that plastic and that repeated wind load, you're just sitting there watching, oh, well, there's the second tunnel, and you've got bent up hoops and plastic shredded up everywhere, and it becomes a nightmare. But at the end of the day, it's just one of those things. It's like, okay, I kind of cheated my process on that tunnel. I should have done this. Now I rebuild them, find solutions to my problem, and move forward. But tunnels are a great way to protect crops from a number of things, and I highly recommend them. But, them in and of itself bring up a whole nother deal. You're talking about 6 mil plastic with UV treatment on it. Not real sustainable, right? Ground cover. Well, it's woven polyplastic. A lot of growers, organic growers, love to use ground cover. I've used ground cover in the past, or silage tarps that you put over your garden, and you're able to get weed seeds to germinate, and it's a form of weed control. But sun and plastic equals breakdown. Broken down plastic equals microplastics, right? So like the further you go in this journey of trying to grow in a regenerative way, you start seeing some of your own solutions that you thought were better than, say, an herbicide. Now you're starting to question, are these solutions that much better? Because microplastics are a big deal. How much microplastic is in our soils that we're growing? Anyways, the tunnels are a great option, but again, in the long run, are they sustainable? I don't know. It's a question I'm asking myself.
With Civilization Cycle podcast, you can learn what to expect as society resets. Agriculture, economy, tech, and history all have mappable cycles, and these cycles affect every aspect of our lives. We can navigate the chaos and thrive together with up-to-date news and information. Also, if you like the content we have here on Civilization Cycle, Think about fueling the discussions and the show by buying us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/civilization cycle. And thank you for all the support.